In this clip, we're going to take a look at working with the density of the hair. Now, before I get into that, I did make some changes to this hairstyle, and I want to show you the changes that I have made. So also, this is not the hairstyle from the previous clip where we used the curves to create the hair. This is from the clip prior. This was the hair we were sculpting and combing in the previous clips. So if I open this up here, the changes are these right here. I'm going to actually give myself a tiny bit more room. It's this volume layer, this clumping layer, and these two noise modifiers. You can see without them, this was the hairstyle we left off with, and I felt that while it worked, it felt a little kind of boring and a little bit dead. So the noise, two layers of it, kind of a large scale kind of little wave, and then this smaller scale noise here, I thought added a little bit more variety. Clumping right here ended up just kind of, creating a few kind of large sections of hair. You could say I have a clump there, clump there, clump there, clump there. And then the volume just kind of overall brought out the shape because I felt it kind of hugged his head a little bit too much. So that kind of brought it back out there, made it feel a little bit more alive. So those are the changes that I made there. Now, as I mentioned, one thing I haven't really approached yet is working with the density, because I wanted to show you several different ways we can do that. Now, we have already looked at some of these ways, but I wanted to look at them all together so you could see kind of the pros and cons of each method. Now, the first method we can access by selecting the hairstyle base right over here. I'll go ahead and bring this up here and bring up our attribute editor. And if you take a look over here, it's this density multiplier, which is currently set at 8. Now, when I started, I believe I had a density of roughly 4. And I believe that's when I started making these changes. Of course, we would have started at 1. So I have increased this since you last saw it. Now, there is something that I haven't really talked about with this density multiplier that you need to be aware of. Much like with the other XGen grooming system we looked at, if we drop this too low, it's obviously going to delete out certain hairs. And then when it tries to recreate those when we bring it back up, it's just going to clone them off of existing hairs or interpolate them off of existing hairs, which means if we drop this really low and then come back up, we lose detail. Now, if I drop this to 1, which is the default, you can see we have way fewer hairs. And if I bring it back up to, let's say, 8 again, you won't notice too much difference, but you may actually see a little bit. We have lost some detail. It's not that big because there were plenty of hairs there to rebuild the hair from, but definitely this is not the hair that I originally had. This becomes far more apparent if I drop this to, let's say, 0.1, where we can see there's very few hairs on the head now, and then bring it all the way back up to 8. And you can see it rebuilt off of those existing hairs, and I now have a very different hairstyle, actually kind of a very messed up version of what I originally had. We have these weird shards of hair in here. You can see everything's kind of blocky. It had to rebuild off of very few curves. So again, that's something you want to be careful with. Going up is always safe. If you drop back down, don't go too far lower than where you initially sculpted your hair. And I sculpted most of my hair between 4 and 8. So again, just be aware of that. I'm going to go ahead and fix this by reloading my saved file. I'll be back in just a second. Okay, we're back. So the other method we have of working with density is using the density brush, which we've also looked at. Now, if you recall, the density brush can't be saved into a layer, so it doesn't matter if you're in a sculpt layer or not. Density brush just affects overall. So before I use density brush, I am going to bring back my hair geometry, which is the geometry I have the hair attached to. That's what I'm painting all my sculpting data on. And I'm also going to make sure I have my hairstyle selected here. So we'll just come up here to Generate, Interactive Groom Tools, and I'll select my density brush. There we go. So let me go ahead and maybe try to add a little bit of density in this area here. So with the tool reset to the defaults, I'll just kind of click, and you can see it's adding in some hairs, but you can see those hairs kind of stick straight up. Might be a little hard to see them with how dense it is overall. I'm going to go ahead and maybe drop this down to, let's say 4 right there. And we'll go ahead and paint in a few more of those. And you can see they kind of just stick out. They don't really blend in all that well. Now, if I go ahead and add them in here, you can see same thing. They are getting some random positions to them, but they definitely aren't matching the existing hairs. To do that, inside of our actual tool here, I need to turn on Interpolate here, and I'm going to interpolate from the current description. So, and you can see now as I add them in, at first they're just going to get drawn in as normal, and then they're going to kind of pop out and start matching the rest of the hairs there. So I can go ahead and increase this to like 20 to make this really obvious. And I'll just kind of draw through there, and you can see all of that now gets built in. So it's nice and dense up here, but much more sparse here. So I can now go ahead and draw that in, and you can see all of the additional hair now starts getting added in, and it blends in, pretty decently with my existing hair. There might be some need to go back in and do some resculpting, but for the most part, it's doing a pretty good job. Now, I can kind of just work on this until I've kind of covered most of the head. However, keep in mind you could always just increase the multiplier so you don't necessarily have to cover every inch of the head here. In fact, if we now jump back into that multiplier, and let's say drop it down to 1, it becomes a little bit more obvious where I've added all those additional hairs. You can see them all here, and definitely not back here. So I can go ahead and add those in right there. So that's another way of adding additional hairs. And this way you can obviously work much more targeted. Maybe we're not going to see the back of the head, so you maybe wouldn't worry so much back over there. So the last method is actually going to be based on rendering. So for this one, I want to go back to kind of a very even amount of hair in here. So what I'm going to do is, again, quickly reload my file. All right, so we're back here. And this is the same file we've been working with, except I've added a quick light in here because we're going to do some rendering through Arnold. And again, that's because this next method is render based. So I'll take a quick render of his hair right here. Set the render to go there. And don't worry about the fact that the head is missing. In fact, it's a little easier to see the hair just as is here. We'll discuss later why the head is actually missing. It's the same issue we had in one of our previous modules. But you could see how much hair we have. I'm going to go ahead and click this button to store that image. And now what I'll do is select my hairstyle over here. We'll go to my attribute editor. Let me close some of these off so it's a little bit easier to see. And we'll go to render settings, and you can see that there's a render density multiplier. Now be careful with this. Taking this up really high will, of course, slow down your render, pretty considerably. I'm going to go ahead and double the amount of hair that I had. So again, make sure you also have enough RAM for this. If you're, in your viewport, if you can't handle, it's 4 times as much hair, you might have a similar problem in rendering. But let's see what we get now. I'll go ahead and hit render, and this will take a little bit longer, so I'll pause. All right, there we go. It took actually almost the same amount of time to render, but actually saving and kind of loading that file into memory seems to take a couple minutes. So we can see here that I have considerably more hair added in. And you can see we start to get much more interesting shapes, especially as we have more hair in there. The clumps become more evident, the noise becomes more evident. So you can see that's another way of adding more hair just at render time. So of course, the thickness of the hair is also going to play a role in the density of the hair. Obviously, the thicker the hair is, the denser it's going to look, the thinner it is, and the more hairs we're going to need. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in our final clip, which is going to be based on rendering. However, for now, let's go ahead and end this clip here. And in the next clip, let's take a look at a couple of different methods for animating our hair.